Vice President Kamala Harris has chosen Minnesota Governor Tim Walz to be her running mate in the 2024 presidential election. If the pair is successful in their bid for the White House, it could cause a shakeup here in the Minnesota Senate. I spoke with Minnesota Senate President Senator Bobby Joe Champion about what a Harris-Walz win in Washington could mean for us here in Minnesota.
When we think in terms of that impact on Minnesota, first of all, we have to wait until after the November election. But then if he is selected, which I hope that they are elected, then what happens in Minnesota is that the lieutenant governor becomes the governor. So Lieutenant Governor Flanagan would ascend to be governor, and then I, as the current Senate president, would then ascend to lieutenant governor.
We won't really know anything until November, but once that happens, what kind of timeline would we be looking at for these changes to fall into place?
So I don't really know what the exact timeline is. What I will say is that it should happen expeditiously so that it calms the nerves of Minnesotans as well as the rest of the country.
You would be one of those positions to rise. Is this an opportunity you'd welcome, serving as lieutenant governor?
It is something that I'd be willing to do and to serve because I believe in serving Minnesotans. I think that there is also an opportunity historically for us to not only applaud what happens in Washington, D.C. with Vice President Harris becoming the first woman, an African-American woman, to be president of the United States, but it also creates that same opportunity for Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan, who is Native or Native American, to ascend to become governor, which will be the very first time a woman and Native American woman to be governor. And not to mention, not just in Minnesota, but across our wonderful nation. And then last but certainly not least, for me to ascend from being Senate president, where it's already historical because we've never had an African-American person or person of color to be president of the Minnesota Senate or any legislative body here in the great state of Minnesota, then I would ascend to become the first black lieutenant governor of this great state.
If you were to move into the lieutenant governor role, what would happen to your seat as the Minnesota Senate president?
What would happen is by that ascension to lieutenant governor, that means my seat becomes vacant and open. I naturally assume that there would be a special election declared immediately so that we can meet the prescribed timelines in order to get that seat fulfilled.
Currently, there's an open Senate seat that could change the leadership of the Senate, which would then have a Republican serve as lieutenant governor alongside Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan, who's affiliated with the DFL, should the Walz-Harris ticket win. This happened a few years ago with then Senator Michelle Fischbach. Do you know how that worked out at the time, and if that were to come to pass this time, how it could work out now?
It would really depend on a lot of timing. One, what happens in Senate District 45. Two, when Governor Walz resigns, and then who is the president at the time of that resignation. And so I just think that there's so many variables that would come into play. But you brought up a specific name. So Senator Fischbach at the time, when she was president, a vacancy arose, and if my memory serves me correctly, it's because Tina Smith, who was lieutenant governor, became a senator. She was appointed, and then Senator Fischbach held both roles. And there was a lawsuit that was put forward, and that lawsuit was dismissed early on just simply because of the basis for the lawsuit, because it was too early, right? It wasn't ripe, we call it in the law. And then once the legislative session started, a new lawsuit was put forward, but before the courts could make a decision about that lawsuit, Senator Fischbach ended up resigning as Senate president and accepted her responsibility and role as lieutenant governor.
This is kind of like a wait and see time, but it's also a very exciting time. So if you were to give the people of Minnesota one message on this topic, what do you want them to hear and know?
Minnesota is being held up as a state where one can say, look at the great things that they're doing there, and look how it's benefiting the citizens of Minnesota. We could also make sure that you, no matter what part of the nation you're in, you have an opportunity to benefit from it as well. but that only happens by way of elections. There's a quote that says bad officials are elected when good people don't vote. So I recognize that your voice is your vote. So I hope that Minnesotans, especially well, not just Minnesotans, but all across this great country, that we get out and vote and we make sure that our voice is being heard, because it's about our future.